We will now proceed with presentations by Ontario Power Generators, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and Environment Canada pertaining to the subject of methodology used to determine the significance of adverse environmental effects. The panel will hear all three presentations before proceeding with its questions. I would like now to call on OPG to begin their presentation, which is PMD 14-P1.1D. Ms. Swamy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Dr. Swanson and members of the panel. My name is Laurie Swamy, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Decommissioning and Nuclear Waste Management at OPG. For today's presentation, Diane Barker will be the Manager for Environmental Assessment, will provide an overview of the significance of determination for residual adverse effects. When Ms. Barker completes the presentation this morning, OPG would like to address two comments and questions that were raised earlier. Ms. Barker will address EC comments on surface water quality, and Mr. Wilson will respond to a question the Joint Review Panel asked with respect to surface water quality and storm events last week. Ms. Barker.
Good morning. For the record, I am Diane Barker, Environmental Assessment Manager with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. On the phone, we have Mr. Danny De Silva, Principal and Acoustic Noise and Vibration Engineer, and Mr. Martin Rawlings, Senior Air Quality and Environmental Assessment Specialist, both with Golder Associates. Today, I will present information on OPG's response to Information Request EIS 12510 relating to the significance determination for residual adverse effects of the Deep Geologic Repository for low and intermediate level waste. In this presentation, I will provide context and a brief overview of the information request. I will describe the reasoned argument approach used to assess the significance of the predicted adverse effects of the DGR. For each residual adverse effect identified in the environmental impact statement, I will provide an overview of what would have been required to result in a significant environmental effect and the results of OPG's assessment of significance. As noted in OPG's written response to this information request, the use of the reasoned argument approach to significance assessment confirmed the conclusion of the environmental impact statement that the DGR is not likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects. I will also discuss OPG's confidence in the significance assessment. In general, it is not practical to provide numerical levels of confidence in the significance. Our confidence is based on the conservative assumptions as part of the precautionary approach used in identifying adverse effects and the experience and expertise of the people conducting the assessment of significance. OPG's environmental impact statement presented a technical approach to significance assessment using decision trees. This approach assessed the significance of potential residual adverse effects in a stepwise manner relative to the set of criteria included in the environmental impact statement guidelines issued by the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The information request required OPG to present a detailed narrative to explain how the significance of each residual adverse effect on the biophysical environment and on Aboriginal interests was determined. The narrative was to use context-based reasoning and use references, where available, to provide defensibility. Where it was necessary to rely on experience, this was to be plainly indicated. Each residual adverse effect was to be presented as a separate narrative, and in sufficient detail to allow a third-party reviewer to understand how the conclusion was reached. OPG reviewed the information request against published literature and recently completed environmental assessments. The reasoned argument approach to significance assessment is one of several methods described in literature. It is consistent with the approach suggested by Dr. Dunker, and it meets the requirements of the information request. In developing the response to the information request, an early draft of one section of the reasoned argument narrative was provided to Dr. Dunker for review. Based on his comments, further enhancements to the response were made prior to submission to the Joint Review Panel. Consistent with the reasoned argument approach, OPG first identified one or more conditions that would result in an effect being considered significant. These conditions formed the basis for hypothesis statements, which were developed for each residual adverse effect on the biophysical environment and for Aboriginal interests. In developing each hypothesis, the specialists reviewed relevant available scientific literature and other sources of technical information, including environmental assessments for other projects with similar effects. In some cases, there was little literature information, and the experience and knowledge of technical specialists contributed to the development of the hypotheses. Significance was determined by comparing each residual adverse effect identified in the assessment against the relevant hypothesis statements. The reasoned argument assessment of significance relied on the assessment of effects, including the identification of residual adverse effects, that was completed and documented in the environmental impact statement submitted to the Joint Review Panel in April of 2011, and that was the subject of discussion at previous hearing days. Having described the methodology, I will provide a summary of the narrative significance assessment for each residual adverse effect, the conclusion reached, and OPG's confidence in the conclusion. For hydrology, the residual adverse effects identified were changes to flow in existing engineered ditches on the Bruce nuclear site. There will be a decrease in flow to the North Railway ditch, which is shown in the photo on slide 5. This decrease in flow will not result in any adverse effects in Stream C, which is cold water habitat and to which the North Railway ditch flows. In the interconnecting road ditch, which discharges to McPherson Bay and Lake Huron, there will be an increase in flow. OPG's hypothesis of what is a significant change in flow in an engineered channel are shown on slide 5. A change in flow would be significant if it resulted in flooding or erosion of the ditch or sedimentation that would block flow. These hypotheses are based on standard engineering principles for the design of ditches. The North Railway ditch, in which a decrease of approximately 30% in flow is predicted, is not considered aquatic habitat, and under current conditions is often dry. The decrease in flow in the ditch has the potential to result in an increase in deposition of sediments in the ditch. However, the change is small. Increased sedimentation will be managed to ensure that flooding is avoided. Therefore, OPG concluded that the decrease in flow in the North Railway ditch is not significant. In contrast, the average annual flow in the interconnecting road ditch was predicted to double during site preparation and construction and increase by about 1.5 times during operations. This increase has the potential to exceed the existing capacity of the design capacity of the ditch. However, OPG has committed during the engineering phase to evaluate the design capacity of the ditch. If necessary, OPG will resize the ditch to accommodate the flow and avoid flooding, and provide appropriate erosion control. This effectively addresses the potential adverse effect, and so OPG concluded that the increase in flow in the interconnecting road ditch is not significant. Our high degree of confidence in the significance conclusion is founded on well-established engineering design principles. Terrestrial environment. The residual adverse effect identified for the terrestrial environment was a loss of eastern white cedar as a result of removal of mixed wood forest. In southern Ontario, including the regional study area, eastern white cedar is a common and resilient species. The 8.9 hectares of mixed wood forest represents less than 1% of the mixed wood forest in the local study area. The DGR project site is in an already industrialized site that has been subject to intermittent clearing, disturbance, and regeneration over the last 60 years. In determining what would be significant, OPG considered literature on forest ecosystem sustainability, professional experience with forest ecology in southern Ontario, and guidelines issued by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources respecting natural heritage protection in land use practices. This information indicated that, in addition to direct loss, other factors such as ecological function and connectivity were important considerations in assessing significance. The literature generally indicates that relatively large losses of contiguous forests with sensitive functions may be considered significant. OPG's hypotheses statements are presented in slide 6. Tested against these hypotheses, the loss of eastern white cedar was assessed to be not significant. The loss will not affect the sustainability of eastern white cedar as a tree species, as it is a relatively abundant local species. The mixed wood forest to be removed comprises 3 small, isolated stands that have already been fragmented by other activities on site, that have limited use by wildlife, and are marginally connected with the core natural heritage system. For these reasons, OPG has a high degree of confidence in the conclusion that the loss of eastern white cedar is not significant. Aquatic environment. 2 residual adverse effects are predicted on the aquatic environment. Construction of a culvert across the South Railway ditch will alter aquatic habitat for the red-bellied dace, creek chub, and variable leaf pondweed, burrowing crayfish, and benthic invertebrates. Secondly, removal of habitat for burrowing crayfish, shown in the photograph, in other areas of the project site will result from site preparation and construction activities. Fisheries and Oceans Canada applies the risk management framework to decision-making under the habitat protection provisions of the Fisheries Act. In assessing sensitivity of fish habitat, Fisheries and Oceans considers species sensitivity, dependence on habitat, and habitat resiliency. OPG developed its hypotheses of what would constitute a significant adverse effect based on these ecological principles and the judgment of our technical experts. OPG's criteria for significant effects are presented in slide 7. The South Railway Ditch is a constructed intermittent drainage ditch, though some portions are continuously wet. OPG will construct the crossing such that it will not disrupt flow in the ditch or affect watercourse continuity or migration through the study area. The area to be affected is a small portion of similar habitat available elsewhere in the site study area. It is considered to be marginal habitat in comparison with other habitat in the site and local study areas, and has been sustained through previous man-made interferences. The area to be affected does not contain unique species, features, or ecological functions within the study areas. The VECs that would be affected are common and resilient species. The area of burrowing crayfish habitat to be lost represents less than 1% of the available habitat in the project area. The habitat to be lost is in areas that have been previously disturbed by construction activities at the site. OPG has a high degree of confidence in the conclusion that the removal of a small portion of aquatic habitat within the project area is not significant. Air quality. During the site preparation and construction phase, concentrations for 9 air quality indicators are predicted to increase over existing ambient concentrations. During the operations phase, 8 air quality indicators are predicted to increase over existing ambient concentrations. These were identified as residual adverse effects. Effects of decommissioning are considered to be similar to those of site preparation and construction. OPG's hypothesis is that for a significant adverse effect to result from the DGR project, ambient air concentrations outside the site study area would have to exceed the relevant ambient air quality criteria more than 10% of the time. Ambient air quality criteria in Canada are typically set such that occasionally exceeding criteria is not likely to result in significant adverse effects. The Canada-wide standards development process included acceptable frequency for exceeding the criteria value while still achieving the standard. The maximum ambient concentrations for suspended and fine particulate matter may exceed ambient air quality criteria periodically during the site preparation and construction and decommissioning phases of the project. While the effects may occur throughout the site preparation and construction phase, they are predicted to occur less than 0.5% of the time. To provide some context, this is less than 2 days in any year. The area where the exceedances occur is just outside the fence line of the Bruce nuclear site. And while it is accessible to the public, it is not in an area used for residential purposes. At human receptors, none of the indicators exceed relevant ambient air quality criteria. During the operations phase, predicted emissions do not exceed relevant ambient air quality criteria. For these reasons, OPG concluded that the increase in ambient concentrations of particulate matter is not significant. Our high degree of confidence in this conclusion is founded on the use of a conservative approach to predicting effects, site-specific meteorologic data, and an established air dispersion model. Noise. During the site preparation and construction and decommissioning phases, a noticeable increase in noise is predicted near Baie de Duray. Published literature includes information on how changes in noise level affects people. Based on available literature, OPG's hypothesis was that for changes in noise levels to be significant, they would have to be disturbing. That is, the noise level would need to increase more than 10 decibels over the quietest existing hourly noise level. The increase in ambient noise predicted to result from the DGR project is 5 decibels. For this reason, OPG concluded that the increase in noise resulting from the DGR project is not significant. Although not a part of OPG's hypothesis for significance, OPG also considered the reference materials that Health Canada mentions in its sufficiency review. As part of the assessment of effects on human health, Health Canada's 2010 reference was considered. For the DGR project, this threshold is not exceeded. The noise levels associated with the DGR project will be less than the 30 dBA noise level inside buildings recommended by the World Health Organization to minimize sleep disturbance. DGR project noise will also be less than the more recent World Health Organization's recommended night noise guideline of 40 dBA outside dwellings at all receptors calculated over the period of a year. For these reasons, OPG has a high degree of confidence in the conclusion that the increase in noise is not significant. Turning now to Aboriginal interests, the DGR project is predicted to have an adverse effect on Aboriginal heritage resources. The effect is a diminished quality or value of activities undertaken at the Jebegmagoon burial site, which is located on the Bruce nuclear site more than a kilometer to the southwest of the DGR project. There are no absolute effects thresholds in literature to use when evaluating the diminishment of quality or value of ceremonies. OPG's hypothesis was that for an effect to be significant, the activities associated with the DGR project would have to prevent or interfere with access or activities at the burial site. OPG follows a draft protocol to ensure that access is granted when members of the Aboriginal community request access to the burial site. No changes in access to the site will result from the DGR project. Activities associated with site preparation and construction may result in increased noise and dust levels at the burial site and may contribute to a diminished quality or value of ceremonies undertaken there. Adverse noise and dust effects are associated only with the site preparation and construction and decommissioning phases and can be managed so that they do not result in adverse effects during ceremonies or observation of the burial site. The visibility of structures associated with the DGR project, including the waste rock pile, may contribute to the diminishment of value or quality of ceremonies. However, the DGR project is not expected to change the existing industrial nature of the Bruce nuclear site and is therefore not expected to prevent or interfere with ceremonial activities. For these reasons, OPG concluded the effects of the DGR project on the Jebegmagoon burial site are not significant. OPG is confident in this conclusion because the project will not change existing access arrangements, and indirect noise, dust, and visual effects can be managed and mitigated if necessary. For several components of the biophysical environment, no residual adverse effects were identified, and therefore an assessment of significance was not required. As part of the response to the information request, OPG developed significance hypotheses which would have been used for these components of the environment if a residual adverse effect had been identified. For an effect arising from radiation and radioactivity to be significant, the predicted doses to humans would need to be above regulatory criteria. For non-human biota, the effects would have to have been predicted to be above established screening criteria to be assessed as significant. For an effect on near-surface geology and hydrogeology to be significant, OPG hypothesized that there would have to be migration of contaminants of potential concern in excess of relevant criteria on a frequent and/or continuous basis, or alteration of the shallow groundwater flow regime to an extent that sensitive or critical habitats would be altered on a frequent or continuous basis. For an effect on surface water quality to be significant, concentrations of contaminants in releases would have to exceed relevant discharge criteria or result in alteration of the surface water quality regime sufficient to result in adverse effects to sensitive or critical habitat on a long-term or continuous basis. In conclusion, OPG has now used two different methodologies, each based on accepted environmental assessment practice, to assess the significance of the residual adverse effects of the DGR project. The CNSC used a third methodology. Each of these assessments reached the same conclusion, that the DGR project is not likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects. The detailed narrative explains how the significance of each residual adverse effect was determined and provides a transparent assessment of significance. It is presented in a manner that allows a third-party reviewer to understand how the conclusion was reached. OPG has confidence that the DGR project is not likely to result in any significant adverse effects to the environment. OPG's confidence is based on the use of the precautionary approach in the assessment. In addition, a follow-up monitoring program is proposed to verify the predicted effects and the effectiveness of mitigation measures. This completes the presentation on significance assessment. As Ms. Swamy noted in her introduction, I will now address the comment in Environment Canada's submission PMD 14-P1.4 on page 8. As noted by Environment Canada, OPG incorrectly attributed to Environment Canada a statement in CNSC's response to undertaking number 47 that compliance with the proposed discharge criteria would result in compliance with Section 36(3) of the Fisheries Act and would not be deleterious to aquatic communities in McPherson Bay. With respect to surface water quality, OPG reiterates that it is committed to compliance with applicable regulatory requirements. Results of surface water quality modeling completed in 2012 indicated that with appropriate mitigation, discharge from the stormwater management pond could meet proposed discharge criteria without the need for additional treatment. OPG is aware that through the environmental compliance approvals process, discharge limits may be established which may differ from those proposed in the EIS. If needed to meet regulatory criteria, OPG will implement treatment. I will now turn to Mr. Wilson.
Derek Wilson for the record. Last week, the panel asked if OPG could comment briefly on the consequences of unplanned releases from the stormwater management pond. The panel would be particularly interested in distinguishing among the various constituents of concern that would be in a stormwater management pond versus in the repository itself. During construction, there will be approximately 27 liters per second going to the stormwater management pond. Contributions to that stormwater management pond from the underground development activities is greater than 80%. The next largest contributor is runoff from the surface facilities at 10% and from the waste rock management pile at approximately 6%, and then 2% from direct precipitation. During the operations phase, however, the discharge from the underground workings is limited to any water inflows from the shafts, which is conservatively estimated to be less than 0.5 liters per second, and 7 liters per second in total going to the stormwater management pond from surface runoff conditions. This information was discussed in detail as part of the July 18th, 2012 technical information session, as well as the October 1st, 2013 hearing days. The stormwater management pond, following best practices as documented in the Ministry of Environment's Stormwater Management Planning and Design Manual, is designed to contain the 6-hour, 25-millimeter storm event and safely pass the 100-year storm event. As discussed in 2013, the stormwater management pond is subsequently sized to be able to contain the 24-hour, 10-year storm event as currently proposed. For both the construction and operation phases, the prime constituent of concern in the overflow discharge would be total suspended solids associated with surface runoff. We have modeled other constituents that could be affected, such as unionized ammonia and total dissolved solids at peak concentrations from the waste rock management area. And these would be in concentrations consistent with the detailed modeling provided in 2012 as part of the Bruce County peer review. Predicted concentrations are at the point of the stormwater management discharge and do not take into consideration mixing with waters from other sources contributing to the drainage ditch to McPherson Bay. It's conservative and does not take into consideration mitigating measures or reductions in concentrations from the waste rock management area over time. The stormwater management pond is designed to direct the overflow to the interconnecting ditch and not back towards the project site or the North Marsh. As part of good operating practice, in the event of such a storm, discharge from the underground activities would be suspended as to not contribute to the loading of the stormwater management system, as there is sufficient capacity for storage in the underground sump system.
Thank you very much.